Kev, before you
More than
start,
once.
I want to do a dedication if it's okay with you for the shir.
Why not? Sure.
Okay.
Kev, you're such an
Excuse
angel.
me.
You're an angel.
All
Okay.
right. Arthur, just give me a sec, mate. I know you with the light is an angel. I know that. I just need to do this. Now, I wanted all of us just to wish a long life to Michael Kupowitz because it's his father's Yahrzeit. It was actually on Friday night and Saturday, but obviously we weren't giving a shir. So I'd like to dedicate the shir, both Kevin's teaching us as well as me and all your guys' wonderful questions, to the Yahrzeit of Barney Symon Kupowitz and wish Michael long life. Guys, anything you want to say?
Amen.
Amen. We all wish him a long life. Yeah, absolutely.
Wish you a long life. Aruch Hashem.
Amen.
Yeah.
Okay,
So,
teach us, Rav Kevin.
so Damon, in a few minutes, I'm going to start walking. Then you can put me on mute to the bus
Okay,
stop.
but
Okay.
teach us. How's it
I'm sitting on a bench. I've done my benching, but I'm sitting on a bench. As you get a park bench here in Ramat Beit Shemesh. Okay.
Okay,
So
that's
I found
pretty
this book. There's every week the OU, the Orthodox Union, publishes this book, Torah tidbits, and they've got all like Dvar Torahs in here, and they've actually got a halacha thing which I found, which we can just go through, just for
Sure.
a few. I hope it's interesting. So it says the Rabbi Daniel Mann of the OU. The question is, can I count the cake and other foods I eat at a shul kiddush, followed by a regular Shabbat meal at home, as the second and third meals of Shabbos? And the answer he gives is, the question arises only if one is lenient on what constitutes Sudash Lishit. The Gemara in Shabbos 117b derives from the pasuk about the manna to be eaten on Shabbos, and found in Shmot chapter 16, verse 25, which uses the word Hayom 3 times. Hayom is today, that one should have 3 meals on Shabbat. The straightforward reading of the Gemara is that the 3 meals are primarily equivalent. Since the first 2 Shabbat meals must include 2 loaves of bread, that's in Shulchan Aruch and Orach Chaim, we should expect the same for Sudash Lishit. Indeed, this principal opinion of the Shulchan Aruch, except when it is difficult. On the other hand, the Shulchan Aruch cites as a minority opinion of the possibility to fulfill Sudash Lishit with foods other than bread. Talmudic source for a possible leniency is in Gemara Sukkah, and it's about a rejected opinion of Sukkot. Okay, and just another minute, I won't carry on. It's a bit long, this thing. Rav Eliezer says that one must eat 14 meals on Sukkot, and that if he missed one, he should eat an extra meal on the night of Shmini Atzeret. The Gemara asks that the bread meal he has on Shmini Atzeret is for the day, and answers that the Hashlama, the make-up meal, is by eating Minei Targima, exactly what there is, and this is in Tosfot, in addition to the regular meal. Tosfos and Brachas recites Rabbeinu Tam as learning from here that one does not need bread to be considered a modest halachic meal. For example, Sudash Lishit. To say that at least Sudash Lishit requires bread because of the derivation from the manna. Okay, now just my own point, I'll finish with that. For Sudash Lishit, you can actually have fruit. You can say that you can actually have a Dvar Torah with it in mind without actually eating anything. So you can have fruit or mezonot for Sudash Lishit. It doesn't actually have to be bread. I might say it later, but I don't want to go on too long. So this is the book, Torah. You'll see it when you come to Israel one day, Gavin and Damon. Arthur may have seen it.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, so guys, we're going to get started. I spent some time with Rabbi Cohen this evening and this afternoon, and I said to him that Gavin had a very good question, and it's been bothering me for a long time. And that question is, if there was a whole huge diasporic community in Babylon, when it uses that as an example, as well as other communities, when we were expelled from Eretz Israel, or even in certain points where we were allowed into Eretz Israel, but there were communities abroad, why didn't they get their act together in terms of judges that could ordain all matters? And Rabbi Cohen answered, and he said, look, Damon, he said, you all, including myself, still view things from a secular mindset because of the way we grew up. Now, what happens is, he said, this question hasn't only bothered you now, it's bothered you in Sanhedrin and Gavin too. Because what often happens is we see cases at which people can, inverted commas, get away with murder, not only figuratively, but literally. But the truth of it is, he said, that's not the case. Because even throughout history, when there's been constraint of judges, where we have almost a situation where somebody has to want to be caught murdering somebody else, because you need hasroa, you need warnings, you need adim, you've got to be rather stupid or suicidal to create a murder sufficient enough to get the death penalty, or be such an act of madness that you don't even look at any sort of evidence piling up against you, especially when you're warned to calm down. So same thing with these civil cases in Babylonia, is that it's not that the judges couldn't make many judicial decisions, but their scope of judging cases were limited in terms of certain parameters. And he said, but the underlying principle is that nobody gets away with anything. It's the illusion that you get away with things. Hashem will make sure that every crime that a person does spiritually, they get an opportunity through sometimes punishments, or sometimes through punishments providing for a kapora if they take the opportunity to redress the issue and bring right to what seems apparent injustice. So he said the fact of it is, there is a biblical commandment that we shall act as judges, so that we can look at cases and see the intricacies of every case and be aware of how brilliant Hashem is in judging cases to a minutiae of detail. But in essence, although we've got a responsibility, as well as the non-Jewish nations, to create courts of law, at the end of the day, people do circumvent the law. It's difficult to catch them with evidence, but we've got to trust that Hashem, especially as far as Jewish people are concerned, where he puts more of his attention than with the non-Jewish nations, it's all going to be redressed in a manner which will be fair. And often when somebody is punished as a result of some other shaliach, not only will the shaliach be punished, but that person is being punished for something that they did. And it all works out. So I hope that addressed your question, Kabb.
No, that's genius answer,
Yeah. So,
No, addressed it spot on.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for asking.
Question.
Thanks for remembering. I appreciate it.
Pleasure. And Rabbi Cohen said it's a superb question. He said it's an issue of our mindset. We grew up in a different mindset, so we've got to gear ourselves towards that. So, with that in mind, we're going to deal with this issue involving. Unfortunately, the shir didn't record the other day. One of the things I've also noticed in our shir, if you look at it from the very beginning to now, we've all aged a bit. Our hair's gone a bit grey. We're getting a receding hairline. And it means a good thing. I was depressed. But it means we've been learning a long time together. Nearly 500 shirim, guys. Which means it's a phenomenal amount that we're aging in the shir. As depressing as it is, it's quite invigorating that we're using our time well. Because time can be your biggest friend or your biggest enemy, depending how you use it. So well done on your stamina, every one of you. All three of you, really. It's a privilege to learn with you.
You the most. You've kept the leadership going, and you've kept us. You pulled the group through. Put it this way. So thank you.
And thank God we've got Rabbi Cohen and Rav Simcha Steinhauer, who's been a continual guidance for us, which has been very special. So now we're in the 84th daf, and the Gemara relates an incident involving bodily injury. So there was once a certain donkey that severed the hand of a child, and the case came before Rav Papa Bar Shmuel, and he told the parties, go assess the 4 things, in other words, the categories of payment for the child. Rava thereupon said to him, but we learnt in the Mishnah that there are 5 categories of payment. Rav Papa Bar Shmuel said to Rava, sure, I meant to say that the assailant should pay the 4 categories, but that's besides the damage, the nezek shalom, the actual damage which he must pay. So Rav Papa Bar Shmuel is again challenged, and this time by a buyer who said to him, but it's a donkey that caused the injury, not a donkey driver. And what's that mean, guys? In the case of a donkey or any other animal, its owner pays only actual damage, not the other categories. The other 4 categories is when man damages man. So if it was the injury caused by the donkey driver, you could understand where those other categories came from. So now that Rav Papa Bar Shmuel was enlightened in terms of the case and started asking specific questions, he said, look, go then and assess the child only for his actual damage. Now, what happened is they replied, in order to assess the child, we need to assess him like a slave, meaning we have to establish some objective value. So Rav Papa says, go assess him as a slave. The father was not happy of the child. He said to him, look, I don't want to embarrass my son. I don't want the child to be assessed as a slave because it's a degrading thing for him. For an adult, it's not, because they understand procedure. So the child was old enough to feel degraded, but maybe not old enough to have the maturity to handle it emotionally. He might have known his own child. So they said to the father in reply, but at the end of the day, you're preventing your son from financially recovering from this, and this money is going to hold him in good stead. So the father appeased them and said, look, when he grows up, I will sort him out and appease him from my own property, meaning whatever you deem he's worth on an initial assessment without him being embarrassing or degrading or invasive. Tell me what I owe, and I'll put that money aside and make sure he'll get it when he's older. Because in any event, as a child, what's he going to spend it on? Sweets. He's going to need it when he gets married, the chuppah, etc. So the Gemara then recounts another similar incident. And there was once a certain ox that chewed off the hand of a child, and the case came before Rava. And Rava said to the parties, go assess the child like a slave. And they said to Rava, but master is the one who said that in any case where one is assessed like a slave, we don't collect for it in Babylonia. Okay, so now this is when it obviously introduces the particular subject. So Rava said to them in reply, the assessment is needed only if the victim seized the ox's owner's property as compensation. In that case, we do need to know how much he would keep. So, guys, I just wanted to ask you one thing as a matter of interest. Okay, just give me 1 sec. Is that, let's go back to the Bava Kamma 15b. What did we learn there? That the courts in Babylonia were not authorized to adjudicate penalty cases at all. They could only provide judgment on compensatory cases. So Rava promulgated another limitation on the Babylonian courts, namely that they could not rule even on compensatory damages when the payment is not fixed. Okay, now we're going to go into the reasons of what that's about, but at the end of the day, not everybody holds by the opinion of Rava. But what they do hold by is the fact that although the courts in Babylonia do not adjudicate such cases, especially penalty cases, if the victim on his own sees some of the assailant's property for his injuries, he's entitled to keep it, because then what would happen in that case is the court could extract from him to return to the original owner's property, but minus the amount that the assailant owes the damaged party. So the moral of the story is, in Babylonia, if you were caught in such a situation, possession is 9/10 of the law. And ultimately, you need to seize that property to make sure you get paid. And it's up to the courts now to redress the issue, because they're forced to, because now it's a case of monetary loss. And they can only give back to the assailant what he has not, which is in excess of the damage he caused. Let's put it that way. So again, Rava's a little bit different in that he says that it's more a case of even compensatory penalty, apart from penalties, compensatory amounts are difficult to collect. So in other words, he's saying any case where one is assessed like a slave, we don't collect for it in Babylonia. Meaning if it requires an assessment and is complex in nature, even compensatory payments cannot be made. So the Gemara now looks at Rava's rule, and where the courts don't adjudicate personal injury cases, where the victim must be assessed as a slave. So Rava follows his reasoning in this matter because Rava said elsewhere, is consistent with his opinion, regarding injuries of an ox, whether that injury to an ox is caused by another animal or by a person, we collect damages in Babylonia. However, regarding injuries of a person, whether they were caused by another person or injuries of a person caused by an ox or any other animal, we do not collect the damages for payments in Babylonia. So in other words, anything to do with animal damage we do, but not with regards to personal injury cases. So the Gemara is looking at this ruling, and it says, why is that for injuries of a person we do not collect in Babylonia? Well, it's saying presumably because we require expert ordained judges, and there are none in Babylonia, meaning that the whole concept of smecha was that it could only be given in Eretz Yisrael. It couldn't be where somebody would receive that rabbinic ordination in Babylonia. But then there's a problem because we can't say that that's the reason. Because if you look at injuries of an ox, you've got that same sort of complexity because in that particular case, they need to be assessed by judges that are known as Elokim. I'm not going to use the Hay word because it's got a double meaning. Elokim is Hashem as the great judge, and the other word for it is Elokim for human judges, meaning they have to have a certain level of expertise. So in other words, in Shmot chapter 21, verse 18, it talks about if men quarrel and one strikes his fellow, that's a case of a person injuring a person. Or it talks of a case where an ox injures a person, if an ox shall gore a man. So on both those passages, it says, unto the judges shall come both their claims. In other words, the Gemara understands the verse to refer to the fact that these personal injury cases need special authority to judge their worth. And even if an ox is damaged, it needs a certain required amount of expert judging. So it's saying, listen, what's the reason that injuries of an ox caused by an ox or a person is different to a personal injury case to a human being? Because either way, they're similar in that they need expert judging. And it's saying, look, with regards to injuries to an ox or any other animal, it's because the judges of Eretz Yisrael have basically, they haven't ordained judges in Babylonia, but they said that this judge in Babylonia is the equivalent of an agent, and is carrying out the charge of the judges of Eretz Yisrael. But just like in a monetary case involving admissions and loans. So in other words, even there are some cases of financial accountability that are judged in Babylon. And one of them is admissions and loans. So admissions and loans, guys, is just a fancy way of saying loan disputes. So why does it use like this fancy way? It's just saying, look, it's an expression. There are two types of evidence that a plaintiff in such a case can present. The first one is known as admissions. So that refers to where the plaintiff produces witnesses who testify that they heard the defendant admit to the plaintiff that he had taken the loan. In other words, they testified to having heard the verbal conversation. And the term loans refers to where there is witnessing evidence that they actually saw the loan take place. So it discusses in Sanhedrin in the second and third daf that the sages waived the ordination requirement for loan cases because they didn't want to inhibit people from lending their money. Because if ordained judges were needed in such a case, potential lenders would hesitate out of concern that qualified judges wouldn't be available to help them to collect on a defaulted loan. So as not to close the door before borrowers, the courts in Babylon carry out the charge of the judges of Eretz Yisrael and judge loan cases. And that's why we have a principle, which means during the Jubilee year, debts aren't cancelled and they're sold to the Beis Din, because otherwise nobody's going to lend money just before the Jubilee year to the poor. So it's a way to assist in that sort of manner. So similarly, the judges instituted the same as Gavin mentioned the other day. When we talked about property damage, he was saying, I asked him why. He said, look, At the end of the day, everybody's going to damage the property of everybody else unless there's some sort of financial restitution where they're clubbed and penalized for having judged damage the property of another. So we need those judges to be able to create law and order. So there's still a problem, because why aren't personal injury cases paid? Well, firstly, the Gemara said in explanation of Rava's ruling, when do we carry out their charge? In other words, when are the agents allowed to carry out the charge of the judges of Eretz Israel? In a matter about which we are certain. But in a matter about which we are not certain, we are not empowered to carry out their charge. Since personal injury cases require an appraisal of the victim to determine the amount of damage, we may not judge them in Babylonia. So, guys, the Gemara objects. On what basis do they object? If you remember the other day, do you remember, any of you? Okay, they basically say, well, we don't understand, because we're not certain about the damage of an animal either. And the animal has to be assessed. So if we're not certain and that's paid, why isn't the damage for a human paid? Okay, how can a person get injured without being paid? But the Gemara says it in a more fancy way. It says, they said in rebuttal, without an appraisal, we are not certain also about the amount of damage that results from injuries of an ox caused either by an ox or a person. So in other words, why may the Babylonian courts adjudicate the cases of animal damage? Rather, it must be because the amount of damage is easier to determine. Why? You just go out and see how much an ox is sold in the market. In other words, it takes no specific genius to work out what a healthy ox of a similar breed and size at that particular age group sells for when it's healthy. And then you can look at what it sells for when it's injured. And then all you do is you simply subtract the amount of the injured ox compared to a healthy ox, and you pay the difference to the owner of the ox to know what he would have lost had he sold the ox in the market. So that's not rocket science. So they're saying, but maybe to judge a personal injury case is more complex. Why? Well, maybe you need neurological tests. Maybe you need to see if what a person's lost in terms of potential, all the intricacies involved in a human being. Because you must remember, when a human being gets injured, the human being is more complex than that. You've got the 5 levels of payment. So the Gemara is saying, well, it's not necessarily the case, because look, let's see on this personal injury case, let's just look at a simple version. A simple version is not when a human assaults a human. It's when an animal damages a human being. Why? Because what do you pay when an animal damages a human being? Only actual damage. When a human being assaults another human being, you pay for pain, you pay for humiliation, you pay for medical bills, you pay for recovery, apart from actual damage. So that's complex to work out. But when an animal hits a human being, it's just the actual damage you pay. So that's relatively simple. Why? Because you go out and see how a slave is sold in the market, and then you'll see how much a personal injury case is. In other words, whatever a slave has with that injury compared to a healthy slave, you'll see the difference and pay the person that's injured the difference when your animal harms them. So that says, listen, you're making it more complicated than it is. It's actually relatively simple. And it asks another question, the Gemara says, and basically, furthermore, while we're on the subject of simple calculations, why can't we pay a double payment, 4-fold and 5-fold payment for theft? Because what's the rationale of the Gemara? These are fixed and they're known payments. So we should carry out their charge. Why aren't those cases heard in Babylonia? Because we understand if the Gemara says, in a matter about which we are certain we can judge, but a matter in which we're not certain we can judge. But it's saying, listen, for theft, you take a cell phone with 2,000 Rand. You have to pay back 4,000 Rand, 2,000 Rand for the phone, and he shall pay double. And that amount is fixed. It's not rocket science to work out what a Samsung Galaxy is worth when it's chapped. So since it's easy and simple to determine, why can't we carry out the agency of the judges and judge that case in Babylonia? And guys, do you remember why we can't? This you should get. Guys, why can't you?
Sorry, I was actually listening, but I didn't hear that last.
Okay.
That last part of that question.
So the
No, I
Gemara,
heard you.
the Gemara is saying, look, when do we carry out the charge of the rabbis as an agent of the court in Babylonia in a matter about which we are certain, but not in a matter of which we are not certain? So it's saying, listen, if you look at fixed payments, when you pay the twofold, fourfold, or fivefold payment for theft, that's fixed. You steal a Samsung Galaxy phone worth 2,000 Rand, you shall pay double. Pay 4,000 Rand. It's easy to calculate. Why don't we pay that in Babylonia? What's the answer, guys?
Because they don't have the judges for it.
No, because we're saying there are cases within the parameters at which we can have agency to judge it in Babylonia. Why are we saying you can't pay it? It's not just a factor of it being a fixed amount. There are a myriad of factors to consider. But the other factor is we don't pay knasot, actually. We don't pay penalties. So the twofold, fourfold, or fivefold payments are penalties. So what we do is we can only say, listen, you stole a cell phone of 2,000 Rand. You pay back the 2,000 Rand. There's no penalty in Babylonia. You don't pay penalties. It might be easy to calculate, but you only pay compensatory payments, not penalties. And according to Rava, unless it's a matter about which we're certain, you don't pay compensatory penalty amounts either. Okay? So we've seen that there's complexity involved here of what gets paid. So the Gemara deflects a second challenge. They said, when do we carry out the charge in a case involving compensatory payment? But in a penalty payment, even if it's simple to calculate and fix, we are not authorized to carry out the charge. So the Gemara asks in return, but concerning an injury of a person caused by another person, which is actually compensatory in nature, we should carry out the charge, meaning it's not a penalty. Okay? So the Gemara is going to issue some new criterion for which the cases can be adjudicated in Babylonia. So when do we carry out the charge? In a matter that is commonplace. However, in the case of an injury of a person caused by a person which is not commonplace, we are not empowered to carry out their charge. Okay, so this did bother me a little bit, and I still don't understand it. Because why, if Jews generally don't assault other Jews, so it's not commonplace, I get it. But why should the fact that it's not common mean that a Jew that's injured by another Jew is not paid back compensatory damage? And not everybody has the opinion of Rava, but since the Gemara brought Rava, it's obviously the opinion here. So it's something I need to ask Rabbi Cohen, and I'm not questioning Rava. I'm questioning my ignorance in terms of why the commonplace issue is so important. And it obviously is. So the Gemara asks, but there are damages of humiliation and depreciation which are very commonplace. Okay? Because while a Jew might not assault another Jew, and that's a level of crassness and violence that Jews are not used to within the community. Jews humiliate other Jews, which is it's not assault, but it's certainly more commonplace because it's not as dramatic. In other words, somebody could embarrass somebody in public, or there could be an issue of depreciation. That's more common. So we should carry out their charge in those cases as well. So let me just explain. The Gemara answers, it is indeed so. For Rav Papa, in fact, collected 400 zuz for humiliation in Babylonia. So let me just explain to you what we're talking about. If you look at a case of depreciation, it's where someone seduces or violates a virgin. So, guys, depreciation, seduces implies that she was complicit, but he also is at fault because he used his abilities and maybe put her under pressure, and she felt that she would be raped unless she acquiesced. Meaning, he could turn around to her and say, "Listen, I'll beat you half to death and rape you, and you'll never be able to stand again." Or you could just submit, and we make this easy. and you give out and you put out. So that's seduction, but it doesn't mean she's a harlot. Maybe she didn't want to be assaulted. Okay? Then there's a case of rape. Both of them are depreciation because the virginity is lost. So that's a financial loss because she's not going to be as valuable to potential men, and the word gets out, believe me. So depreciation is a reduction in the value caused by the loss of her virginity. So because that's common, because that's more commonplace, because unfortunately people do rape, it's more likely than assault, or a man will seduce a woman. It's measured by subtracting the amount of a non-virgin would fetch on the slave market from the amount a virgin would fetch. Because why? Generally, somebody would want to reward their slave and will pay a premium rate for a virgin slave girl. You know, if he's got a very, very loyal slave. I can't get my mindset around the slavery thing. But in the meantime, it's easier to see it with assault with regards to the employee wages as opposed to a business owner. But in any event, if we just look at it on a literal basis, any woman that's been raped or seduced, she's not going to have the same level of choshev of men marrying her compared to if she wasn't. It's unfortunate, but that's the case. So the depreciation is certainly compensatory. And if you look at humiliation, and you said it was a fixed amount, it would be classified as a penalty, right? But it's not a fixed amount. Why? Because if somebody humiliates a politician in public and he loses his career as a politician, like a Monica Lewinsky, what's her name? Whatever her name is. Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton, that sort of thing ruined his political career. Now, if that happened to a normal guy at the office, at worst he would have got fired, maybe. But so in other words, there are different cases of humiliation. If you're a public figure and you've got an important job, the compensation for humiliation is higher than if somebody is not holding at a level of social public importance. So because that's not a fixed amount, it's not considered a penalty. You must remember, guys, a penalty is always a fixed amount. One of the characteristics of a penalty is it's generally fixed. Okay, that you know. The question is, with regards to virginity, you shall pay 50 silver shekels. That seems fixed. So is that not a penalty? There's a whole discussion. But it's compensatory because she would have been worth more before she was raped or seduced. But as far as this case, Rav Papa in fact collected 400 zuz for humiliation in Babylonia, which means, according to Rav Papa, you could collect for humiliation in Babylonia. The Gemara rejects it because the opinion of Rav Papa is not valid according to this issue, because Rav Chisda once sent an inquiry to Rav Nachman regarding payment for humiliation. Rav Nachman sent him a reply in a letter and said, Chisda, are you collecting penalties in Babylonia? So according to Rav Nachman, then, we don't collect for humiliation in the diaspora. So although Rav Nachman called the penalty, the payment for humiliation, a penalty, it shouldn't be taken literally, guys, because the payment is calculated according to the social status of two parties. So therefore it's compensatory in nature. The very fact that it awards a different amount for a public figure compared to somebody that's not a public figure, for example, proves it's a compensatory because what they would lose in their social status. But the Gemara means that the payment for humiliation is like a penalty in certain respects. I mean, you could say the same thing as far as depreciation of virginity. So now that the Gemara has rejected the proof from Rav Papa, the question remains, since humiliation cases are common, why don't we adjudicate them in Babylonia? Because you wanted to say a Jew assaulting a Jew is not common, that's why we don't adjudicate them in Babylonia. But since a Jew humiliating a Jew is not as extreme as physical assault, it's more common. So the Gemara therefore adds that there has to be another criterion for the type of cases that can be heard in Babylonia. Otherwise, Rav Nachman would pay for it in Babylonia. So, rather, what are we empowered to carry out the charge of the rabbis in adjudicating disputes in a matter that is commonplace and also involves a real monetary loss for the plaintiff, as in a loan dispute. So what we said in a loan dispute is nobody's going to lend money if they're going to lose a fortune because they can't collect their debt. Therefore, the poor are going to suffer. They're never going to get loaned. And the rich are not going to go to having huge financial losses if there's no adjudication of case. So where there's a monetary loss, and it's common, okay, such as a loan dispute, that is heard in Babylonia. But a matter that is commonplace but does not involve a monetary loss, or else it's not commonplace and does involve a monetary loss, we are not empowered to carry out their charge. So in other words, it has to have two characteristics now. It has to be three: compensatory in nature. It has to be easy to calculate. That's the second thing. The third thing, it has to be commonplace. And the fourth thing, it has to involve a monetary loss. Okay? And unless those criteria are met, we're not empowered to carry out their charge. So in the case of an injury of a person caused by a person, even though it involves a monetary loss, since it's not commonplace, we are not empowered to carry out their charge. And regarding humiliation, even though it's more commonplace, it doesn't involve an actual monetary loss. We're not empowered to carry out the charge there either, because according to Rav Nachman, okay, so the guy was a bit embarrassed, but it's not like a person that was assaulted and can no longer work. That's a tangible monetary loss. It's not a perceived monetary loss. But because assault is not common, that can't be dealt with in Babylonia. So, look, it's important to know, guys, that although the courts nowadays are not empowered to adjudicate assault cases, it means only that a court cannot order an assailant to pay. But if one person does injure another, the assailant owes compensation to his victim. And unless he makes restitution, as Rabbi Cohen says, he will not satisfy the judgment of heaven. And in that particular case, he's going to get the full wrath of divine justice. But it's not so with penalty cases, because there's no obligation whatsoever in Shemaim until a court on earth pronounces it. And then in Shemaim, at that point, a person becomes obligated, but not before the earthly court judges on that case and comes to a conclusion of a penalty. Okay, it's different to compensatory amount, especially with assault. So now what we're going to discuss next time is some tangible losses. Not humiliation, but what happens if somebody has to have medical bills? Is that not a tangible loss? It is. So the Gemara is going to go through that in the next session. There's 3 minutes left, which is what Kevin gave over in terms of the shir. And I didn't want the shir to be more than 40 minutes. I'm done. I hope you guys had a good shir.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you.
All right. All right, guys. Thanks, Arthur, Kevin, Gavin. I wish you a good Motzei Shabbos. And yeah, thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you. Well done. That was very good.
Bye.